we'll just begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. During this Advent season, as we await the great celebration of the birth of our Lord, we remember the powerful intercession of his mother, Mary, who is also our spiritual mother, the mother of all the living. And so we pray, Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, benedictus fructus ventris tui,
Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei,
ora pro nobis
peccatoribus,
nunc et in hora
mortis nostrae.
nostrae.
Amen. Maria Mater Ecclesiae,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right,
Amen.
very good. Well, we have the privilege of having Professor Daniel Gallagher on again for this series, but people maybe who didn't see your previous show, it would be good for you to introduce yourself, say a few words about yourself, your background, and your interests in your present position.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Fastiggi. Such a pleasure to be with you and Michael again. My name is Daniel Gallagher. I am a lecturer in philosophy and literature at Ralston College, which is a small college, a master's program located in Savannah, Georgia. My academic training is primarily in philosophy and theology, but with a focus in philosophy and medieval philosophy. But I have a whole range of interests, particularly with Catholic teaching, everything from social teaching to natural law, revelation, credibility, and so on. My impetus, the impetus that I have for staying engaged in those areas is simply because of the constant engagement I have with other Catholics and non-Catholics, maybe even particularly non-Catholics these past few years, where I have not been teaching in Catholic institutions. And amongst those people, young people, I find that there's a real thirst for understanding the faith that we believe, and for various reasons, and unfortunately, lack of foundational catechesis that would support their thinking. And so, I'm married, and we have 5 children now, the youngest of which is just in her initial months of life. So we've been blessed enormously by God in our family life as well.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, Michael, we have you here. Would you like to begin with some of the questions we laid out? Yes.
Yes. Great to be with you, Daniel, again. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. So can you talk to us about Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti? This was back in 2020, and contextualize it within the scope of Catholic social encyclicals. How does it fit in within the entire corpus of Catholic social teaching, so to speak?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Michael, published in 2020, published in the midst of the COVID crisis. I would say, first of all, that he explicitly aligns the teaching that he offers in Fratelli Tutti in the history of the social teaching. In fact, he calls it a social encyclical. It's not the first time a pope has actually explicitly called by any means an encyclical social, and this is where it may differ from prior social encyclicals, it's also extremely comprehensive. It is, as I say, prompted by the COVID crisis, and yet he explicitly says it's also very comprehensive. So he uses this, in my opinion, as an instrument to reiterate and recapitulate all of his teaching, in fact, certainly the teaching that precedes the publication of Fratelli Tutti, but then even the teaching, I would say, afterwards, and we'll maybe talk some about that later. So it certainly is in the line of Catholic social teaching. There are significant points at which people have found controversy because of prior social teaching. We'll, I'm sure, touch upon those things as well. But all of that said, whatever we might make of this very long, in fact, encyclical, is that if we're looking for at least the kind of comprehensive synthesis of where social teaching has come and what the Catholic Church is embracing now, it would be Fratelli Tutti. It's not to say that it's the most important Catholic social encyclical, but each, let's say, iteration of a social encyclical has expanded, so to speak, the horizons of Catholic social teaching. And this encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, has in very significant ways. Now, I just have one briefly that, as I introduce myself as well, to say that this encyclical, for me, has marks an interesting point in Catholic social teaching, in that I worked for the Holy See and for Pope Benedict and Pope Francis until 2016. So this was the first major publication after my departure. And I only say that because internally I could say that the way in which this either aligns, or perhaps in the eyes of, in some respects in the eyes of many, does not align with Catholic social teaching, is rooted in some very, well, lack of a better word, avant-garde approaches that Francis was taking as a leader. And perhaps we'll get to that later. In other words, it does reflect a certain approach to the Petrine ministry that we will always remember Francis for, and one which was quite unique in many respects. And the encyclical, as a social encyclical, really reflects not just as much, if not more so, a unique aspect towards teaching and leading as it does in substance and doctrine.
Very good. Well, Daniel, you touched upon this already, but maybe you could expand. What do you think motivated this encyclical? Was it in the planning for a long time, even before you left Rome, or did he feel a special need at this time? Maybe you could talk about this.
Yeah, Robert, that's a very good question. So he does give us some hints of what basically prompted this. I would say one of the most significant things is that if we go back to his election for a moment in 2013, do I have that right? The year. The choice of, when he tells the story of the choice of the name of Francis, it was sort of last minute in the promptings of don't forget the poor, don't forget the poor. However, in some ways, well, I would say clearly Francis thought that to be a sort of inspirational prompting for him to not forget the poor and to take the name Francis in ways in which he hadn't fully thought out. So I felt, while I was still working in the Secretariat of State, that Pope Francis was trying to frame his pontificate and his teaching within the legacy of Saint Francis of Assisi. And he says this pretty explicitly in Fratelli Tutti in the very beginning, that that is the inspiration. That is Saint Francis of Assisi, the inspiration. I think that Pope Francis wanted to expand on that, and he did it in a way that, again, was quite comprehensive and expansive, without necessarily distilling the Franciscan inspiration upon his pontificate, if that makes sense. Now, the other thing I would say from a very practical level is that I felt that from the beginning, Francis, his approach was a sort of ad hoc approach to teaching, which I would contrast in a very interesting way with Benedict XVI, who was much more deliberate. So, and I would dare say perhaps sometimes even excessively deliberate. In other words, that he couldn't be ad hoc enough. And Francis was sort of the other extreme. Now, why is that important? It's because I think that by 2020, Francis wanted to give some kind of a synthesis of his teaching. Everything he wanted to say, not knowing how much longer he would either reign as Pope or just live. And maybe he was undecided, who knows at that point, if he was going to follow in the footsteps of his predecessor Benedict in retiring one day. But in any case, I think that I felt by the time I left 3 years earlier than the publication of this encyclical that Francis really wanted to have one thing that he thought was very synthetic of what, and then after he had done this, he felt that he could go back to the ad hoc approach, for better or worse, and in some ways very frustratingly, perhaps maybe for the worse, for instance, in the eyes of some. But that's what I would view as the impetus of the encyclicals, to get something out there. Of course, he had other material and other encyclicals, but this one, I think, particularly, he'd probably embrace most as what he wanted to leave as a legacy in his teaching.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Michael, do you have any other, we want to have a follow-up question,
Yeah. When the encyclical, there's a really evocative phrase in the early pages of the encyclical where Pope Francis speaks of, quote, dark clouds over the world. And I think it says over a closed world. What is this referring to? What can you explain to us? What's the meaning of the dark clouds, and how does this relate to the theme of hope during Advent?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So, with the latter part of your question, how does it relate to hope during Advent? I've been praying with this encyclical again and thinking about several issues that arise in it, and I must say that Advent being a time of hope, it sort of sheds perhaps a little light on why, not just the dark clouds, but why Francis chose to begin this encyclical with a very long section on the dark clouds. Because quite honestly, I think had I been there, I can imagine this was one of the things would have been discussed at length. In other words, do you want to open up this encyclical with this rather lengthy reflection on these dark clouds? My feeling is that Francis felt that people are not acknowledging the dark clouds with the seriousness with which we have to not just confront them, but acknowledge them. And he wanted to, so to speak, elencate them, list them for us. And what are these? Well, there's several, but he talks about a real turn to individual satisfaction and fulfillment, which we know is a case and we've almost taken for granted. So he almost wants to point out with these dark clouds things that, to look at, have our eyes look up into the sky of, let's say, where we are at this time, 2020, and even today, these things we take for granted. Selfishness that comes with that focus on the self. And indifference, which that's another dark cloud, which he interestingly relates just as much to political, let's say, bodies, so nation states, whatever, with indifference as he does to individuals. Another of these dark clouds, which again he had spoken of in several ad hoc occasions, of a throwaway culture. And the most powerful things he says about the social ill of abortion are precisely related to his idea of what a throwaway culture is. Everything's expendable. Nothing is of value. Nothing is, so to speak, cherished. The elderly, I should say very clearly as well, he's spoken several times, that they're dispensable in some way. Also, more on kind of a political, economical level, the reliance on markets, the optimism in, to be quite honest, in free markets, which has been a recurring theme. I mean, in social encyclicals, and a very complicated one through the years. These are examples of these dark clouds, and I would say the one thing during COVID that particularly bothered him, and which he presents to us as a dark cloud, is this terrible polarization, which he doesn't even have to demonstrate because we know it's out there and it really troubles us. And he saw this ideological polarization as being something which is extremely foreboding for peace in humanity, and he saw it as getting worse. And I have to really credit our prior pontiff for taking that seriously. So to answer the question, that sets the ground for, or should open up, I should say, the horizon for a message of hope. And we'll get to it later, but I have some questions whether Christ is presented, Jesus Christ, as sufficiently, so to speak, placed in the spotlight as the fulfillment of those hopes. I say that because Francis seems to put a great accent on fraternity, the fraternity of humanity, which is certainly has Christological, aspects and roots. But he really seems to be, I would say, I don't want to say, perhaps mildly optimistic in framing an answer to these dark clouds and helping to dispel them by exploring the idea of the fraternity of all of humanity.
Very good. Thank you so much for those insights. They're very
Beautiful.
very valuable and beautiful. Now, in chapter 2, Pope Francis elaborates on the parable of the Good Samaritan. In some ways, this resembles John Paul II, when some of his writings like to pick a particular passage of scripture, like the rich young man, and then draw out the deeper meaning of that. And Pope Francis picks out the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke. And what does he believe this parable teaches us today? Why do you think he picked this out, this parable, in a social encyclical?
Yes, Robert. First of all, I have to say that I really like your comparison of the Veritatis Splendor and the unpacking of the young man, because it's such a memorable part of that encyclical of John Paul, when we have a very extended exegesis on seeking the truth. And I think that from a purely literary standpoint, that is precisely what Francis is trying to do in this chapter, where he opens up this parable from Luke 10 of the Good Samaritan. Now, it's a parable that is very familiar to us, and yet probably in some ways too familiar to us, as any parable is, because we tend to think of it, even as we age. I think of, well into my 50s, but when I hear these things proclaimed at Mass, I have to say that I always, sometimes in a very inhibiting way, have the same message or moral coming through. And the whole thing of a parable is, to speak of what parables are, they're throwing one thing up against another. We should feel uncomfortable and need to look at it again and again and again. And I think Francis, that's what he wants to use in this parable, is to throw it up. So, in other words, we know that the outlines of this parable, we don't have to review those, but what are the things that are kind of new that he highlights here? Well, to mention a couple of them in this rather lengthy exegesis that he offers us, it's the fact that one of them is that we often forget that there is a character here that we never really get to know anything about, and that's the robber. And he spends some time on this, that we should ask that question. There's an injustice that's been committed, and this parable is about a borderless, so to speak, way of going even beyond just redressing the wrong that's been done to this poor man who has been robbed. And so I think for me, that was a really enlightening way to think of the parable too, is to focus on characters that we don't spend a lot of time thinking of. There's also another aspect of this parable that Francis brings out that makes the difference when it comes to the Samaritan and the actions that he takes, is that it's time. So it's just slowing down and stopping. And Francis really felt strongly that, now this is my words, if there's hope for his approach to universal brotherhood, to the fraternity of all mankind, to help in helping us to address these dark clouds that he has painted in the first part of the encyclical, it's that we just need to slow down and take the time and look and find out what's going on, because those who pass by the poor man, right, who has been robbed, they may not have even noticed. That's one way of interpreting this passage, or at least they didn't want to, in some ways, right? So we just need to look. We need to look and acknowledge. So now, briefly, the other things are perhaps more salient to us when we think about this parable of the Good Samaritan. That is kind of the eliminating the us versus them mentality. So the one that we would least expect to perform this charitable gesture and going beyond the call of duty, even, is someone who is a them, so to speak, right? And and that is very striking. And it's this is where I really think, this is where I prayed a lot, because I won't, maybe we could talk about them later, but this has really kind of got me thinking when I think about this parable. It's what happens after, right? Those actions. In other words, someone notices, at least the innkeeper, something like that. I mean, they notice these actions, and then how do they act? And I think this is part of the parable that we often overlook in some ways. That it's a witness of charity, and Francis believed very strongly in that witness. And going back to St. Francis, and we'll talk about it later, but going to Egypt and crossing the lines, he was in the Fifth Crusade, and crossing the lines to talk with the Sultan. He might not be doing it, well, look at me, and this is how we should be evangelized, but you can't help but stop and look at the consequences that an action like that would have. And I think this is part of Francis's analysis of the Good Samaritan as well. It seems like it's an isolated kind of event. There's no attempt on the Samaritan to kind of, to basically be, to explicitly to be noticed, but there's no way that these actions, those who did notice them, wouldn't have talked about them and had an effect on the lives of others.
Yeah, yes, that's very, very good. I just would make one comment. I remember him saying, there are times in our lives where I could identify with several of the figures, the participants in the parable. Like, all of us would want to identify with the Good Samaritan, the hero, but he challenges us. Maybe we're like the priest or the Levite, and we have to consider that. So it was a challenging exegesis.
Yeah, and he even suggested, maybe we should identify it with the robber in some ways, the one who actually just exploited the opportunity of someone, who was defenseless and helpless. And that's extremely challenging. So I agree. Yeah, it's this is a great spiritual traditions, be they Ignatius or the Sulpician tradition. They all have, in very different ways, but ways of this kind of identification. Getting into the Gospels in this way. And I think it is of course, the Franciscan spirituality as well. I think it's something that we can learn spiritually to do, is to not just think of ourselves as that one character like the Samaritan, but go through in our examination every single character, especially when it comes to Pharisees and Sadducees. I think for me, it's like, okay, I'm going to be the Sadducee and pray with that. I think it's extremely important.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, Michael, you have another question about it's such a far-ranging encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. It would be hard to cover every aspect of it, but we're trying to cover some of the more salient or controversial parts. So, Michael, I think you wanted to ask about one controversial passage in the encyclical.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking to this, Daniel. It's been really enlightening, especially listening to you talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the way that Pope Francis has articulated it in the encyclical. So on page number 120 of the encyclical, and I think this is just to situate this within the context, many of our listeners would perhaps be familiar with Centesimus Annus, St. John Paul the Great's brilliant encyclical, when he lays out a sort of approach to the free market and the economy, and how this is incorporated within the Catholic intellectual tradition. And then we have this passage from Pope Francis. And so I was wondering if you could situate it within that context and kind of speak to it. The encyclical says, the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. It says that the principle of the common use of created goods is, quote, the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. It is a natural and inherent right that takes priority over others. And so it's referring, of course, to the universal destination of material goods, which hasn't historically been considered to be in conflict with the right to private property. And so can you speak to that? what is the Holy Father saying in this text, and how does it relate to Centesimus Annus and St. John Paul the Great's explication of this?
Yes, Michael, you couldn't have put it better, I think, in saying that as Catholics, we have to believe, in fact, that not only these two, that is the universal destination of goods and private property, not in conflict, but there's a harmonious integrity to them. And to be quite honest, I find the wording in this number 120 when it comes to private property to be, I'm not entirely comfortable with it, because I do think that in some ways it's being approached as if there is this conflict. Now, that's not to say that there can't be conflict, but from the order of principles, quite honestly, I would find it hard to believe there is a conflict if they're both, if we have two principles, because I think we do have principles. And he's sort of, in that passage you said there, he sort of puts a hierarchical ordering of the principles, which there may be, when he says the principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. It is a natural inherent right that takes priority over others. So the priority is the key here. What kind of priority? Well, as I wrestle with this, and I'll try to frame this in the language of Centesimus Annus and the entire social teaching of the church as best I can. And this priority is that God has given us all of creation as a gift. And in some ways, I think for various reasons, we have forgotten this. And it's complicated how we got to this point. But to that extent, I think there is a absolute priority. If how we frame that in terms of the universal destination of goods is a different matter, but I don't think that it needs to be done to then take private property as a way of respect for this universal destination of goods. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me just share two brief anecdotes to point this out. In our prior home, my family lived adjacent to a family, and with our property, adjacent to property of a beautiful family with whom we became friends with. They had some children that were the children of our age, and there was a lot of playing together and so on. Now, we had been thinking of putting up a fence only for the sake of keeping our children safe, and then it just so happens that the neighbors thought that it would be a good idea to put up a fence because the balls that their children were playing with kept coming into our yard, and other types of toys. Okay. So we talked about this, and there was a sense in which, for the common good of my family and theirs, we decided to put it on my property, and I paid for it, and I was happy to do that. I wasn't only happy to do that because I now found an excuse to do something that they wouldn't interpret as being in some way standoffish or something like that. In other words, that I took joy in the fact that this was something that we had agreed upon and would only kind of like, I would say, enhance the friendship that we shared with him. Okay, now, so be patient with me. I have one other anecdote that results that refers to that same neighborhood. There also was a local attempt to create more passage spaces through people's backyards for connecting by pedestrian way to other streets. This is a common thing in neighborhoods, right? And this was discussed in the homeowners association, and a plan was come up with. And people, again, they freely chose to donate their property lines for this purpose, and a certain encroachment of common property to make these, passages. Now, all I want to say that let's just think of it, how these two things could have been addressed. What if, the local politician said that we had to put up a fence, right? For, the same result, perhaps on my property, but we were told to do that, or that someone came in and said, "Sorry, we're going to choose your house and and we're going to put in a passageway here." Now, I'm not making a statement about the role of government in these decisions. My point is this, that I think it's an example where by the ownership of property, by having private property, it puts us in a position, if we are in, by the way, our neighbors were deep Christians as well. They were Orthodox Christians, but puts us in a position where we have our eyes open to possibilities of how everybody can benefit, and we are prompted to freely give what we have. In my case, it was actually not just the property donated, but I paid for the fence because it would enhance, right, the good of everyone. Now, that's a long answer to basically say that it's difficult to put these two principles together, but they are not in conflict. That is the principle of universal destination of goods and private property. Now, as far as church teaching is involved, let me just use one example. If I can, because I think this is a little simpler, rather than going to centesimus annus right away, I think quadragesimo anno. If we use quadragesimo anno as a good touch point here, that John Paul tried to expand on the idea of a pinus sociale, a social, so to speak, agreement, sometimes translated as social mortgage, which is okay to think about this. But I think that Solicitud Res Socialis, I said quadragesimo anno, I meant Solicitud Res Socialis in 1987. And I think this is a pretty good way of expressing this. There's no perfect way, but this is one way that we can get into this. And I would hope that Fratelli Tutti had this kind of thing in mind, even though the language is a bit strong, and it does seem to challenge the idea of, a right to private property. And I think that in a discussion I had with Robert there, he brought out a good point that the inviolable is actually untouchable, intoccabile, and that carries over to Spanish and French and so on. Which it's a fine, so to speak, linguistic analysis if we get to that point. But I think that if we interpret that with a hermeneutic of charity, in other words, the fact that it is true that we're not saying to say that it's inviolable or untouchable, right? That someone can come and just take your private property away. It's simply that this private property has to be put, as I've put it, I think, into this larger horizon of putting it to the disposal of the public good, and ourselves realizing not only that ourselves, that is, those of us who enjoy the gift of property, whatever form it might take, in that we owe it. We do owe it, right? In some way. So anyway, that's how it initially get in this. But this is we're now in, I think, to the most discussed, at least in the Anglophonic circles. I think the most discussed parts of the encyclical, the ones we have to wrestle with the most. So I'm just trying to lay down some ideas that would help us to realize that we shouldn't just jump necessarily to think that there has been a radical change in church teaching. There may be some kind of a change, a refinement, but I'm not convinced that we have now an overturning of prior teaching, going all the way back to Rerum Novarum.
Very good. Thank you so much. You have such a great historical perspective on these matters, Daniel, so we're very grateful on that. Now, you mentioned controversy, and in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis offers thoughts on war and the death penalty. And why have his positions on war and the death penalty generated so much controversy? Maybe more so even on the death penalty than what he says about war, which some say is a little bit more traditional. But maybe you could offer some thoughts on these two topics.
Yeah, so taking your cue, Robert, perhaps I would just spend a little bit more time on the death penalty and just say something about war here. Of course, the background of the criticism is those who do acknowledge, rightly so, quite a sophisticated and intricate idea of just war, going all the way back particularly to Augustine, and wondering if now this has been challenged, this teaching of just war. In fact, he does say, so to speak, that this, he uses strong language of this now being kind of at least obsolete. I mean, that's quite strong. I think the idea is mostly that there are principles we need to turn to that would be more helpful than just war. That's how I would understand that. But let me just point out historically that people forget, just to, I don't know how helpful this will be to listeners, but we must remember, for example, not only Pope John Paul II, but Saint Pope John Paul II being extremely vociferous in his latter years, and sometimes in quite a pointed way of actions of the United States, and Iraq and so on war. So this is not something new that Francis has now introduced. Now, without going into the details, because perhaps we want to move on to the death penalty, but here's one with my students. Here's one thing that I point out, that in the just war tradition, interestingly, if you look at it very carefully, it's not that the church and its thinkers have ever said that in some cases war is good, objectively good. So, for example, when we look at Thomas Aquinas, the way that he prefers to phrase this in the Secunda Secundae of the Summa, is utrum bellare semper si peccatum. Whether to conduct war is always a sin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this we're getting into finer points here, but I think this is extremely important because I've actually been criticized for my writing on the teaching, particularly since Paul VI, on what the church has taught with war. Because to be quite honest, with some exceptions, and John Paul would be one who had he unpacked at certain occasions the whole just war tradition. In most cases, going back to Paul VI and even John the 23rd, it's been an outright cry to end war. And we can think, for example, of Paul VI in 1965 at the UN General Assembly, right? No more war, no war. And we have to take that cry as not just a rhetorical move on the part of the church. He is she who has the privilege of saying this in a way that other nations cannot, but actually a developed teaching on peace, and which we can't get into the now. But I just think that's really important, because a lot of the if they don't say it, a lot of the people that I have kind of had arguments and debates with on what the church is now, I'd say after about 50 years when it comes to war, and culminating what Francis says in Fratelli Tutti about war, I think we have to remember that the war is sort of an exception, right? And there are ways to justify armed intervention in that way, but the question is always utrum bellare sit semper peccatum, whether it's always a sin. But it's not an objective good. I don't think that would be the right way of saying to it, that it's objectively it's a good thing. So Kissinger, famously said too, in his way that Henry Kissinger said, I don't think that anybody likes war, and I just think there's wisdom in that. In any case, but maybe we could just turn to the death penalty briefly then. A word about that.
Yes.
So Frattelli Tutti is extremely interesting and important here because it laid the groundwork for an actual change in the catechism, if we remember. And one which has, again, been quite controversial, as you pointed out, with people really, more so, as you suggest, Robert, having problems with this because they see this as a real, change in church teaching. In other words, if to review, it's that the Pope Francis basically revised the teaching of the catechism to basically say that it's a violation of human dignity. So in paragraph 2267, right, that there's an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. So that's one aspect of the dignity of the person that's not lost. And then it goes on to say that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. So Francis is obviously, he's the one who has made this change. But again, for the historical record, we can't go into the details. I just mentioned, having worked at the Holy See, this was a question about this change that goes all the way back, at least to John Paul II, maybe before, but there was a large dossier precisely on how to make a change like this. So this is not an invention. And Benedict himself was, in his own way, he was committed to someone, perhaps not himself, but taking action on a sort of updating in church teaching on this. Now, Here is I can't go into the details, but I think what Fratelli Tutti does and the change in the catechism, it really challenges us to do what? It challenges us to re-examine where we've come theologically and philosophically in our understanding of the dignity of the person. We take that too much for granted. We think that this is something that goes back. In fact, I have a lot of students who think this was a Greco-Roman classical invention. Well, I'm going to use a little hyperbole for a second and say it's not. This is a Christian insight, the dignity of the human person, right? In this way, and we've developed an understanding of it, and so that's what we have to take as the baseline if we accept church teaching. I gladly listen to those who differ and who say that this has been a substantial teaching and change in church teaching. But I think that we have to remain open to, first of all, accept what the church teaches and trying to understand that as people who think and reflect on these things in ways that perhaps we haven't thought of before.
Thank you very much for those insights. I've also written and reflected upon this because I liked, from an ecclesiological viewpoint, I like to see development of doctrine and how to understand it. In my opinion, I think it was John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae 9, where he gives the example of God protecting the life of Cain. And then he cites St. Ambrose, not even a murderer loses his dignity. So I even remember Cardinal Müller talking about this. He says that's the question, whether or not a murderer loses his dignity and right to life. And so
Right.
that you put it in that sense, and then John Paul II had just said it should only be allowed if there's no other possible way of defending public safety.
Right.
But what you were saying about war never being a good, I think in some ways the church, if you examine the history, never saw the death penalty as a good.
That's right.
There were individual theologians who saw it as a good, but why at the Fourth Lateran Council were clerics forbidden to hand down death sentences or even be present for executions?
Right.
And then in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, someone applying for holy orders would be deemed irregular if it had been a judge who had handed down a death sentence. Well, why? If that's something good, why did this make it into canon law? So I see this as like indications that it was a necessary evil. It wasn't something good, but it was.
Yes, I agree with you, Robert. I agree, and I think that's how we have to approach this. And going back to John Paul II, I think that what I've been doing some work on recently, but it's the initial stages, and it's quite lugubrious as far as a project. But I do think that Karl Wojtyła, before becoming John Paul II, some of these insights were philosophical, that informed his thinking as Pope. And he really, I think, struggled to try to say the same thing that Francis did, and he was still working on it, and wasn't quite there. But in other words, I think that there are the insights of phenomenology of the human person. And this is a very, more of a kind of an academic topic, I suppose. But in some ways, I really see this as influencing a development that led to what I agree with you, with a development in church teaching on this. But I think that the foundation, as you said, what I had said about war and what you're suggesting about the death penalty, I think that's kind of where we have to start, with an understanding of the different classifications of bonum, or goodness, right? And you pointed out perfect examples, I think, of how it was always, like you say, an exception, right? An evil that's tolerated. And I think war is the same thing. It's always a malum, And so anyway, very good. And we're still, as a church, I think we have a long way to go, and perhaps fleshing this out. And I think that all of us who think about these things do have sort of an obligation to put on the heart and mind of the church and try to do what will, not to just accept these things unthinkingly, but in a way which promotes the deepening of the thinking.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And now, Michael, I think you want to ask another provocative question, if I'm not.
Yes, there are many, many provocative questions, and thank you for the wonderful explanation, Daniel, on this. I think it's been very enlightening, and Robert, the point about John Paul II's contribution as well is so vital. So thank you so much. Can you speak to something you mentioned earlier, and I think is really, really prescient, let's say, very, very on point. One of the criticisms of Fratelli Tutti is that it's not sufficiently Christocentric, right? And you talked about the love for everybody does have obviously Christian roots, because Jesus tells us in the gospel to love one another. But we know that there's a secular humanism in the culture, and there's an emphasis on love that is absolutely not Christocentric, that's not focused on Christ, that actually, you might say, displaces Christ and puts the human person rather than Christ at the center. And so, can you speak to this criticism of Fratelli Tutti specifically, that it's not sufficiently Christocentric, and then also tying it in with Pope Francis's description of the encounter of St. Francis of Assisi with the Sultan, which we know is a historical kind of launching point for a lot of the ways in which we might understand this encyclical.
Good, yeah, thank you, Michael. And this touches upon for me personally, what I found to be the most problematic aspect of this encyclical, which I admire as an encyclical and as a piece of teaching of Francis. But to summarize my discomfort with this encyclical, you put your finger on it, and I don't think that it is Christocentric enough. Now, what I mean by that is early in the encyclical, we can find a certain language that Francis uses, and I have I think I have it at my finger. Yeah, when he says towards the beginning that, quote, although I have written this encyclical from the Christian convictions that inspire and sustain me, I have sought to make this reflection an invitation to dialogue among all people of goodwill. Now, I find there's a lot that's packed behind that statement. And I contrast this with Francis of Assisi a bit in my own public arguments about Fratelli Tutti. And I don't want to necessarily be alarmist, but I think this is a theological issue that we need to acknowledge. Namely, that we can't really just take the insights that we have from our faith and Christian revelation and then put parentheses around them and try to present them to the world as being sufficiently persuasive in a way that will be thorough. And dare I say, perhaps we would deceive ourselves thinking to be more effective if we bracket it from Christ. And these could be such things as love and peace. I mean, anything you want to take, fraternity, community, and so on. And I am ambivalent whether Fratelli Tutti does this, but I am pretty sure that Fratelli Tutti does not take the same kind of Christocentric approach to these issues and to Catholic social teaching in general as prior teaching has done. And if we take John Paul II as an example, and there are quotes that I won't offer right now, but that I've gone through that I can see, in fact, that there's a different, they would say in Italian, impostazione, a different kind of framing or approach to these issues when it comes to Francis. Now, how does this relate to Francis of Assisi? Well, this again is a difficult to interpret because we don't have a lot of historical details. But when he goes to speak to the Sultan, he crosses enemy lines, and he does write about, and we have other attestations to his instruction to his followers that this is the approach they should take. That they're not just going to go through a list of, let's say, incontrovertible truths, Christian truths, and go through a method of discursive argumentation, theological, but rather to witness in the spirit of poverty, generosity, charity, and love. Okay, so that was the idea. Now, what's interesting historically is that there are those who will argue, there's a book out now, I'm sorry, I can't remember the author of the title, but that I saw, that we have to, acknowledge too that in some ways we could view Francis's attempt to do this as a failure. And I don't want to dissect that, but what I want to say and what I point out in my writing in this is that it was thoroughly imbued, that is, Francis of Assisi's attempt, with one, a desire to bring people to Christ, and two, a Eucharistic Christocentrism that drove him to do what he did, to talk with the Sultan. And this is the Franciscan, so to speak, legacy. And I stand to be corrected, but I do have a fear, just somewhat of a fear, that it is not only been distorted slightly in Fratelli Tutti, but in some interpretations of Francis of Assisi was all about. So I hope that helps to clarify. But I don't want to necessarily, by any means, I hope that I haven't dissuaded people from thinking they have to take Fratelli Tutti seriously, but just to invite people to think about what I see to be a slight difference in a sort of lack of a Christocentric focus that was characteristic of other or various predecessors of Francis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. That is so enlightening, and you've done a really good job of explicating that. And would it be fair to say, and maybe this is not exactly the right language, but the word I was thinking of in English would be a different emphasis. It's a different. There's a different emphasis. I read St. John Paul II, and then I read Pope Francis, and both the Holy Father, and we should respect and honor and love both of them. But there's a different emphasis that just comes across in their writing that I can't help but feel and sense that there's something different that's there. It's a different spirit. I don't know what you want to say behind it, but a different emphasis, I think, is maybe one way we could articulate that in English.
Yes, I think so, Michael, and actually for more reasons than one. So the word, if we just take the word emphasis, can be a bit misleading because we think of in English as meaning like, okay, you can emphasize this or this, right? And it's kind of like indifferent what you choose to kind of like, we almost say like highlight, I suppose would be the English word. Now, what is the word emphasis, right? Means it's almost like a downbeat. And so it's the downbeat that, so to speak, it's more than just a random choice of a downbeat, but choosing something that's going the emphasis of, whether it's going to be a 2/4 time signature, 4/4, or 3, whatever it is, that it's going to influence everything. And that's what I see possibly going on in Fratelli Tutti. And that's why I do think it's the right word. If we look deeply at the roots of that word, it's the downbeat, I think, needs, in my opinion, needs to be more on that all of the dreams, and that is the word that Francis uses, the dreams that he has and wants to fulfill through this universal brotherhood, that I simply don't think, unless Christ is the downbeat, we can make progress, but I don't think that we're faithful to our mission if we think that it's an arbitrary choice of whether to include Christ in this message or not. We don't always have to, again, for Francis, Christ was always the message, just how it was communicated. That's another way of putting it. And I think that's the point, that there's no question, I think, that Christ is our message and drives us and all that stuff. But there are lots of different ways. And Francis of Assisi was the best example of this, who had these intuitions on, hey, that can mean more than one thing. So emphasis is a good word. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This is very insightful, and yes, there's a different way of posturing or presenting, one's view of different historical events. So I think that's excellent. What if someone were to respond to your statement that this lacks a Christocentric or Christian orientation, with several points of the encyclical? For example, in number 277, Pope Francis has a section on the Christian identity. And he says, yet we Christians are very much aware that, quote, if the music of the gospel ceases to resonate in our very being, we will lose the joy born of compassion, the tender love born of trust, the capacity for reconciliation that has its source in our knowledge that we have been forgiven and sent forth. If the music of the gospel ceases to sound in our homes, our public squares, our workplaces, our political and financial life, then we will no longer hear the strains that challenge us to defend the dignity of every man and woman. And then someone could say, well, it ends with an ecumenical Christian prayer invoking the Trinity. But
Mm.
is it because it's not integrated well enough that the
I think
Christian
so,
identity?
yes. I think so, Robert. So I think it's a great paragraph that you pointed to there. And if I'm not mistaken, he's quoted at length at that point from Nostra Aetate, which is a wonderful
Yeah.
document from the Second Vatican Council, which a document which I would say is, if we're going to have some kind of a corrective type of thing, that would be the best one to turn to. But I think, Robert, you open up the possibility and asking me this question of the way of looking at this. I think, and this might be a little harsh, but sort of a footnote to the entire document, because it would be, so we can envision what would it have been like for him to write something, maybe even with a more limited audience, a Christian audience, to unpack that very quote and to say how we're supposed to do that in having the gospel sing in all those places, in our homes, our public squares, our workplaces, it's so on. So just to give one example of where we could look for a possible contrast, all the way back to the 1960s, Joseph Ratzinger, who became Benedict XVI, was working out the idea that as Christians, what we may need to do is to really unpack how we make the music of the gospel resound in all of those places and put our efforts into that, right? It's not that we have to take our eyes off the world, but that is now the way the world we find ourselves in as Christians. Continue to unpack that, right? Rather than the very grand messages, right, that we think are going to resonate precisely because we're, again, tempted to brack the Christian part of it and just take what we can and think that people are going to really kind of find this persuasive enough that, that now that Christ is not in the way and conversion is not, let's say, our primary goal of those with whom we engage, then we can make some headway into this. Does that distinction make sense?
No,
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, yes, he's right. He's talking about Nostra Aetate and recognizing the truth and goodness in other religions, and of course, he's acknowledging we enter into dialogue as Christians. But I think what you're saying is we need to examine the world and the dark shadows that we're experiencing through the lens of Christ.
Yes. Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah, because it just we have so many examples in history, and mostly in the modern period, to be honest, when we thought we could solve these things, right, in a way that just depended upon, let's say, even interreligious. You can almost think of interreligious dialogue being the apex, right, of a human achievement that will make headway in this. And I think that we have examples of that. That's really not the case. I'm not speaking in any way against interreligious dialogue in Nostra Aetate. I think there's an impostazione, so to speak, in that quote that he utilizes in Fratelli Tutti to say that the real answer to this is going more deeply into the gospel rather than the prima facie attitude of thinking it's getting in the way of
Yes.
understanding one another. So,
No,
yeah.
this is right. Just as you were talking about private property and the universal destination of goods, that there should not be any ultimate conflict. There should not be any conflict between the proclamation of the gospel and dialogue with
Yes, right.
people of other religions. And there was that one document, very good, 1991, Dialogue and Proclamation, that tried to explain that these two are not
Yes,
opposed. They're interconnected, but they're not identical.
right.
Very good. Well, Michael, we'll leave the last question to you. It's a very general one.
Thank you so much, Robert. Daniel, and you've done this, you've done a really systematic, beautiful job of unpacking some of the highlights of this encyclical. On the positive side, the challenge that it gives us as faithful Christians, but also the concerns with, the controversy and how we can understand that as Catholics. Can you speak to us about the strengths and the weaknesses of the encyclical and just kind of give us the overview of what do you see as the really strong points of Fratelli Tutti and what are the the areas where it's maybe not as strong.
Yes, thank you, Michael. One way that I could, I think, answer this is to say that there are certain aspects of this encyclical which are both a strength and a weakness. Now, I'm speaking from someone who's, sat inside there trying to figure out how to communicate with the world. So perhaps I could briefly answer the question from that point of view. What I mean is, in the Secretariat of State trying to assist Benedict and Francis in communicating through documents like this. So the same thing could be a strength and weakness. So the scope of Fratelli Tutti can be a strength, viewed as a strength in some ways, right? Because it's very comprehensive. It was deliberately so, and Francis tells us that at the opening encyclical. We can view that as a strength in the sense of the average reader, be they Christian, Catholic, or not, right, would have if they have the patience to read through a relatively long encyclical, to reason with Francis, right, and to allow it to penetrate and so on. On the other hand, that can also be a weakness, in my opinion. And again, this is a strategic way of looking at strengths and weaknesses, and that it's just too comprehensive. And precisely for the last point that we just talked about, and of this focused, so to speak, kind of teaching. And I take Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, an example of this, who very in a very insightful way started to think about this as the kind of approach that we should take, that is, the Christian. What I mean is that not that other things don't matter, but to craft our message such that we say just enough, right? And that we particularly strengthen the brethren, in Paul's words, in the faith to do the work. And the fact that this encyclical, I'm not convinced that it does that successfully. That might be a weakness of it, by just simply being too comprehensive and too broad. Of course, there are other strengths and weaknesses. We touched on all of them. There are several ways to look at this, but that might be one way of seeing that sometimes a single aspect of an encyclical can be both a strength and weakness. And when there's a decision, Pope has to make a decision on what to say, when to say it, and how to say it, that it's not just a matter of the correct expression of doctrine, but it's the instrument of expression, and even tone and audience and all of these things. And I have no envy for Pope Leo the 16th as the 14th, excuse me. Pope Leo the 14th as he has to make these decisions.
Yes, that's very good. I mean, one commentator, Father Perella, whom I've met on this recent document for the DDF, he says it's too long. It lacks the kind of sobriety that a document should have. And maybe that would apply to this, although popes have their own way. Even people criticize John Paul II for being rather prolix. And one professor I knew said, it seems like this is not populorum progressio, but populorum progressio.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So that, what John Paul II wrote, if you take the time to read it, it was like a spiritual experience.
Yes. This is a big question, Robert, because I think we will reach a point. It might not be Leo; it doesn't have to be, but there may be a pope who decides, again, it's sort of a parsimonious approach to exercising. And what I mean is a more, it's a discerning approach on what to say when, and leading in perhaps in other ways. I don't know who that would be and when, but we've gone in that direction of prolix, as you say now, for decades. And I am one who personally thinks that we could be distracted and have been distracted by that approach. Maybe even under John Paul for as wonderful as his pontificate and his teaching was. Yeah.
Yes, because what happens then is people will read the headlines or the little summaries, so journalists control the narrative oftentimes of these matters. And I mean, journalists have a job to do, and I highly respect them. But that's people only have so much time. But I remember one cardinal, I won't mention his name, who said he really admired when John Paul II spoke on Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. He says there he was very precise and clear, and that's all he needed to say. But even then,
I think it was 3 paragraphs, right? If I remember, 3 or 4 paragraphs at most. Maybe it was 2, but that's right. That's a pretty good way of, at least on the doctrinal matter like that. that is the way we need to speak. That's a good example. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, Professor Gallagher, for taking your time out, especially during the time of grading exams. I could appreciate that. And we give thanks for your wisdom and your experience. And also we give thanks to God for your wonderful family, too. So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you,
thank you
Robert.
so much for sharing. And we'll just end with the glory be. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it
As
was
it
in the
was in the
beginning,
beginning, is
Beginning
now,
is
and
now
ever
and
shall
ever
be,
shall be,
world without
world
end.
without end.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, Merry Christmas and happiness for the new year. May
And
God
to you and to all the listeners and loved ones. Thank you.
thank
Bye-bye
you so
now.
much. Bye-bye now.
Merry
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Christmas.
Merry
Merry
Christmas.
Christmas, Daniel.
Yes.
Merry Christmas,
Thank you,
Robert.
Michael, and Merry Christmas.